Margaret Holloway returned to Seattle on a gray Tuesday afternoon after a week-long consulting trip in Boston. At 69, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her posture remained straight and her steps deliberate. For nearly 4 decades, she had lived in the same high-rise overlooking Elliott Bay, a quiet 12th-floor apartment filled with the kind of memories that quietly accumulate over a lifetime. She expected nothing unusual when the taxi stopped outside the familiar glass entrance. Instead, the first sign that something was terribly wrong came when the doorman stepped in front of her. Daniel Carter had worked in the building for almost 20 years. Margaret had watched his hair turn gray and had sent holiday cards to his children when they were young. He was not a man who blocked residents from entering their own homes. Yet there he stood, shifting awkwardly as Margaret approached with her suitcase rolling behind her. "Mrs. Holloway," he said quietly, "I need to give you something." Margaret frowned, confused but patient. Daniel handed her a folded envelope. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she immediately recognized. The letters were slightly slanted, written with the same confident strokes she had seen since childhood. Her granddaughter's handwriting. Margaret opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a short note written on a single sheet of paper. "You're no longer welcome here. The apartment belongs to me now. Please don't come upstairs. It's better for everyone if you simply leave. Claire." Margaret read the sentence once, then again. For several seconds, she didn't move at all. The lobby around her continued its normal rhythm. Someone crossed toward the elevators. The faint hum of traffic seeped through the revolving doors. But for Margaret Holloway, the world had suddenly stopped. "I don't understand," she said quietly. Daniel's eyes avoided hers. "Miss Claire left that with me yesterday. She told me to give it to you when you returned from your trip." Margaret tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. "Is she upstairs?" "I don't think so. I haven't seen her today." Margaret inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had endured difficult moments before. Her husband had died young. Years later, her daughter had been killed in a highway accident that left behind a frightened 9-year-old girl who suddenly needed someone to raise her. Margaret had stepped into that role without hesitation. Claire had grown up in that apartment, surrounded by Margaret's quiet determination and careful guidance. Now that same child had apparently locked her out. Margaret reached into her purse and removed her keys. "I'll just go up and speak with her." Daniel hesitated again. "Mrs. Holloway, I think the locks have been changed." The words landed like stones. Margaret slowly lowered the keys back into her bag. Around them, 2 residents had begun watching the scene unfold. The attention made the situation feel even more unreal. "When were the locks changed?" she asked. "2 days ago." Margaret nodded once. Her mind began working automatically, the way it had during years spent running a financial advisory firm. When something unexpected happened, emotion could wait. Facts came first. "Did movers come to the apartment recently?" Daniel looked surprised. "Yes, ma'am. Big trucks. Yesterday and the day before." A cold sensation crept through Margaret's chest. "What were they taking?" "Furniture mostly. Boxes. Paintings. Everything," Margaret realized. She thanked Daniel politely and stepped back outside into the damp Seattle air. The taxi driver was still waiting nearby, scrolling through his phone. Margaret stood on the sidewalk staring up at the building's 12th floor. One of the windows belonged to her living room. From this distance, it looked the same as always. But something inside had clearly changed. "Need another ride, ma'am?" the driver asked. Margaret turned slowly. "Yes," she said. "Take me to the Harborview Hotel." During the short drive, she pulled out her phone and opened her messages. The most recent conversation with Claire appeared perfectly normal. 3 days earlier. "Safe flight tomorrow, Grandma. Call me when you land." Margaret had replied with a simple heart emoji. There had been no warning. No argument. No hint that something was wrong. She dialed Claire's number. The call went straight to voicemail. Margaret tried again. Voicemail. By the time the taxi reached the hotel, The sky had darkened into evening rain. Margaret checked in, accepted a key card, and rode the elevator to the 7th floor. The room was clean but impersonal, decorated in neutral colors designed not to offend anyone. She placed her suitcase beside the bed and sat down. For a long time, she simply stared at the note. "You're no longer welcome here." Around midnight, her phone vibrated. A message from Claire. "There's nothing to discuss. Your belongings are being sorted. You can arrange to collect personal items next week." Margaret called immediately. To her surprise, Claire answered. "Claire," Margaret said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "What is happening?" The reply came cold and distant. "You know exactly what's happening." "No, I don't." A brief pause followed. Then Claire said something Margaret never expected to hear. "You're not really my grandmother anyway." Margaret felt as if the air had vanished from the room. It was technically true that Margaret had married Claire's grandfather when Claire's mother was already a child. But Margaret had raised that girl as her own daughter. And when tragedy struck years later, she had raised Claire with the same love and devotion. Blood had never mattered. "Family isn't just blood," Margaret said quietly. "You know that." Thomas says that's exactly the kind of thing someone says when they've been lying for years. Thomas. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Claire had begun dating Thomas Reynolds about 8 months earlier. Margaret had met him only a few times, but something about him had always felt wrong. He asked too many questions about Margaret's investments, her property, her savings. "What has Thomas told you?" Margaret asked. "The truth." "And what truth is that?" "You've been planning to sell the apartment and cut me out of everything." Margaret sat upright. "That's absurd. You'll have to explain that to the lawyers." The line went dead. Margaret remained seated on the edge of the hotel bed long after the call ended. Outside the window, Seattle rain continued tapping against the glass. Somewhere along the way, something had gone terribly wrong. But Margaret Holloway had spent her entire life solving complicated problems. And if someone believed they had just erased her from her own life, they had underestimated her. Because the story was only beginning. Margaret Holloway woke early the next morning in the unfamiliar quiet of the hotel room. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The ceiling above her was smooth and blank, nothing like the faint crack that ran across the corner of her own bedroom ceiling at home. Then memory returned all at once. The note, the locked door, Claire's voice on the phone. She sat up slowly and reached for her glasses on the bedside table. The envelope lay beside them, exactly where she had left it the night before. Seeing Claire's handwriting again tightened something inside her chest, but Margaret forced herself to remain calm. Panic had never solved anything. For most of her professional life, she had advised companies on how to survive financial crises. She had seen executives freeze when everything collapsed around them. The successful ones were always the people who focused on facts instead of fear. So she began with the simplest step. She needed to see the apartment. After dressing and drinking a quick cup of coffee from the hotel machine, Margaret called a taxi and returned to the high-rise building where she had lived for 38 years. The morning air was cool and damp, the kind of Seattle weather that turned the sidewalks dark with moisture. Daniel looked genuinely relieved when she walked through the lobby doors again. "Mrs. Holloway," he said quietly, "I was hoping you might come back." "I need a favor," Margaret told him. He glanced nervously toward the security desk. "What kind of favor?" "Access to the apartment. Just for a few minutes." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Technically, I'm not allowed to do that. The ownership records were updated yesterday." Claire filed the paperwork with the building office. Margaret felt a wave of disbelief. "She changed the ownership?" Daniel nodded. "According to the documents, you transferred the apartment to her last month." Margaret stared at him. "I did no such thing." Daniel hesitated for several seconds. Then he lowered his voice. "I believe you," he said. "Something about this whole situation feels wrong." He looked toward the hallway leading to the service elevator and made a decision. "I can get you upstairs using the master key, but only for 15 minutes. That's all I need. They rode the elevator together in silence. Margaret watched the numbers climb slowly. 4, 7, 10, 12. When the doors opened, the hallway looked exactly as it always had: soft carpet, framed artwork on the walls, quiet afternoon light coming through the windows at the far end. Margaret walked toward her apartment door feeling as though she were approaching a place from a dream. Daniel unlocked the door and stepped aside. "You have 15 minutes, he repeated. Margaret pushed the door open. The first thing she noticed was the echo. For decades, the apartment had been filled with furniture, shelves, artwork, rugs, objects that absorbed sound and made the rooms feel warm and lived in. Now, every step she took produced a hollow sound that bounced off the walls. The living room was empty. The antique oak dining table, where Claire had once done her homework, was gone. The Persian rug Margaret had purchased during a business trip to Istanbul had vanished. Even the tall bookshelves that lined the wall had been removed. Only pale rectangles remained where paintings had once hung. Margaret walked slowly through the space, absorbing the full reality of what had happened. The sofa where she and Claire used to watch movies together had disappeared. The piano Claire had learned to play as a teenager was gone. Every room looked the same: stripped, erased. In the kitchen, the cabinets stood open and bare. Copper cookware that had belonged to Margaret's mother had vanished along with every dish, utensil, and appliance. Margaret moved down the hallway toward the bedrooms. Her own room had been almost completely emptied. The mattress remained on the floor, but the dresser, wardrobe, and bedside tables had all been removed. Jewelry boxes that once held family heirlooms were missing. Margaret paused in the doorway. Her wedding ring had been stored in one of those boxes. So had the pearl necklace she had planned to give Claire on her 30th birthday. A sudden vibration in her purse broke the silence. Margaret pulled out her phone. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "You shouldn't be there. Leave now or we'll call the police." Margaret didn't need to guess who had sent it. Thomas. She ignored the message and continued down the hallway toward the last room, Claire's bedroom. Unlike the rest of the apartment, this room looked untouched. The bed was neatly made. Childhood photographs still hung on the walls. A small shelf of stuffed animals remained on the window seat. Margaret stepped inside slowly. Something on the bed caught her attention. A manila folder. She opened it and began flipping through the documents inside. Within seconds, her heart began pounding. The first page was a deed transfer for the apartment. According to the document, Margaret had legally signed ownership over to Claire several weeks earlier. The signature at the bottom looked almost correct. Almost. Margaret studied it closely. After decades of signing contracts and legal agreements, she knew her own handwriting extremely well. This signature was slightly too sharp, the angle of the letters just a little off. A forgery. The next document was worse. Power of attorney. According to the paperwork, Margaret had granted Claire full authority to manage all of her financial accounts. Margaret turned another page. Bank statements. Large withdrawals had been made over the past 2 weeks, amounts totaling tens of thousands of dollars. She hadn't authorized any of them. "So, you found the paperwork." Margaret spun around. Claire stood in the doorway. Behind her, Thomas leaned casually against the hallway wall. Claire looked different than she had only 2 weeks earlier when Margaret left for her trip. Her posture was stiff, her expression guarded. The warmth Margaret had always seen in her granddaughter's eyes had been replaced by something colder. Thomas, on the other hand, looked completely relaxed. "Well," he said with a faint smile, "this saves us some time." Margaret held up the documents. "You forged my signature." Claire shifted slightly. "It's not that simple." Thomas laughed softly. "Actually, it is." Margaret's voice hardened. "This is fraud." "Let's not use ugly words," Thomas replied calmly. "Think of it as moving things along." Margaret looked directly at Claire. "Why?" For a moment, Claire didn't answer. Then she said quietly, "You were going to leave anyway." "What are you talking about?" The emails on your laptop, Claire said quickly. The real estate agent. The retirement communities in Arizona. You were planning to sell the apartment and disappear. Margaret stared at her. Those emails weren't about me. I was helping a friend research options for her mother. Claire's face flickered with uncertainty. Thomas stepped forward immediately. She's lying. Margaret ignored him. Claire, she said softly, look at me. For several seconds, Claire hesitated. Then her eyes met Margaret's. You've known me your entire life, Margaret continued. Do you really believe I would abandon you like that? Silence filled the hallway. Thomas broke it with an impatient sigh. This conversation is pointless. He grabbed Margaret's arm suddenly. You need to leave. Margaret pulled away from him and gathered the folder of documents. I'm taking these. Thomas reached toward the papers, but Claire stopped him. Let her go, she said. Thomas frowned. Why? Because it doesn't matter anymore. Margaret walked past them without another word. Her heart was pounding, but her thoughts had already begun organizing themselves. Forged signatures, unauthorized withdrawals, illegal property transfer. Thomas had made a mistake. He believed she was helpless. But Margaret Holloway had spent 40 years navigating legal contracts, financial negotiations, and corporate disputes. And now she had evidence. Downstairs, Daniel looked up anxiously as she stepped out of the elevator. Are you okay? Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, she said. Then she added something Daniel hadn't expected. I think I just found the beginning of my solution. Outside, the gray Seattle sky was beginning to brighten as the clouds thinned. Margaret stood on the sidewalk and opened her phone. There was only one person she needed to call. Her attorney. Because if Claire and Thomas believed this story was already finished, they were about to discover something important. Margaret Holloway was not the kind of woman who surrendered her life without a fight. Margaret Holloway had worked with attorney Rebecca Lynn for nearly 15 years, long enough to know that Rebecca disliked surprises. She was the type of lawyer who prepared for everything weeks in advance, who kept files organized down to the smallest detail, and who rarely reacted emotionally to even the most dramatic situations. That was one of the reasons Margaret trusted her. But when Margaret finished explaining what had happened, Rebecca leaned back in her chair and removed her glasses slowly. This, she said carefully, is one of the most serious cases of financial fraud I've seen involving family. Margaret sat across from her in the downtown law office, hands folded tightly in her lap. Outside the large windows, Seattle's skyline stretched beneath a pale afternoon sky. The city looked calm and ordinary, completely unaware that Margaret's life had been overturned in less than a week. Rebecca spread the documents Margaret had brought across her desk. The forged deed. The power of attorney. The bank statements. Your signature has definitely been copied, Rebecca said. It's good work, but it wouldn't survive a forensic examination. Margaret nodded slowly. So, we can reverse everything? Rebecca hesitated. Yes, she said eventually, but not quickly. Margaret frowned. What does that mean? It means the legal system doesn't move at the speed people expect, Rebecca explained. We'll need to file a fraud complaint, involve law enforcement, challenge the property transfer, and freeze the accounts. Even if everything goes perfectly, it could take months. Margaret exhaled slowly. Months. I don't have a home right now, she said quietly. Rebecca's expression softened slightly. I understand, but rushing this could make things worse. If we make the wrong move, they might try to hide assets or destroy evidence. Margaret looked down at the documents again. Do you think my granddaughter planned this? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. I think, she said carefully, that someone convinced her it was a good idea. Thomas. Margaret already knew the answer. Rebecca tapped the power of attorney document. This is the most dangerous piece of paper in the folder, she said. With this, Claire could legally access almost everything you own. She already drained several accounts. Yes, but not all of them. Rebecca opened her laptop and typed quickly. Your retirement accounts are still untouched, she said after a moment. So are several investment portfolios. Margaret felt a small wave of relief. At least they didn't get everything. Rebecca looked at her again. Margaret, I need to ask something difficult. Go ahead. Are you prepared for what happens if we pursue criminal charges? Margaret met her gaze. What do you mean? I mean that if the police investigate, Claire could face serious consequences. Fraud, forgery, identity theft. Those are felony charges. Margaret stared out the window for a moment. Images from Claire's childhood surfaced in her memory. A little girl learning to ride a bicycle in the parking lot. School concerts where she played the piano nervously. Late nights studying at the kitchen table while Margaret helped with homework. That girl felt very far away now. She made her choice, Margaret said quietly. Rebecca nodded. Then we moved forward. For the next hour, they developed a plan. Step 1 was immediate damage control. Rebecca contacted the banks and began freezing any accounts Claire might attempt to access. She also filed preliminary paperwork to challenge the property transfer. Step 2 was evidence. Do you have documentation for the items taken from the apartment? Rebecca asked. Insurance records, photographs, purchase receipts. Most of them are in my safe deposit box. Perfect. That gives us leverage. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Leverage? Rebecca leaned forward slightly. Court battles are expensive and slow. But if we prove that specific items were stolen and are now being sold illegally, we can pressure them into negotiating. Margaret considered this. So instead of fighting for everything immediately, we target the things we can prove belong to you beyond any doubt. Margaret nodded slowly. It wasn't the revenge she imagined during sleepless nights at the hotel, but it was practical. And Margaret Holloway had always believed practical solutions were usually the strongest ones. As she prepared to leave Rebecca's office, her phone buzzed in her purse. A message from an unfamiliar number. She opened it. This is Thomas. You're making a mistake. Back off, or people will start hearing about your memory problems. Margaret read the message twice before handing the phone to Rebecca. Rebecca's eyebrows lifted slightly. Well, she said, that was careless. Why? Because threatening messages make excellent evidence. Margaret felt the first hint of something she hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. Confidence. Thomas believed intimidation would scare her. Instead, he had just strengthened her case. That evening, Margaret returned to the small apartment Daniel's sister had agreed to rent her temporarily. The space was modest, barely 600 square feet, but clean and quiet. A small kitchen sat beside the living area, and a narrow window overlooked a row of maple trees swaying gently in the evening wind. Margaret had never imagined living somewhere like this after decades in a spacious high-rise overlooking the bay. Yet, strangely, the simplicity felt calming. She placed her suitcase beside the bed and sat at the small table near the window. Her phone buzzed again. This time the message came from a different number. Unknown to her, but not unfamiliar. Claire. Grand, we should talk. Margaret stared at the message. Several seconds passed before another text arrived. Thomas says the lawyer is bluffing. Margaret typed a response slowly. Then maybe Thomas should speak with the police. She set the phone down. For a long time, she sat quietly, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside. Her entire life had shifted in a matter of days. The apartment she once believed would hold decades of memories was gone. But something inside her had also changed. The grief and shock were beginning to transform into something else. Resolve. Claire and Thomas thought they had taken everything from her. Her home, her belongings, her security. But they had overlooked something important. Margaret Holloway had spent her entire career solving problems for powerful companies that underestimated her. Now those same skills were about to be used in a much more personal battle. Across the city, Thomas Reynolds sat in the living room of the 12th floor apartment that used to belong to Margaret. Boxes filled with antiques and furniture surrounded him. A laptop sat open on the table displaying online marketplace listings. Relax, he told Claire casually. Your grandmother is bluffing. Claire didn't look convinced. You didn't see the lawyer's letter. It's just intimidation. But what if she actually calls the police? Thomas leaned back in the chair. They'll never believe her. Why not? He smiled confidently. Because we already made sure people think she's losing her memory. Claire stared at him. What do you mean? Thomas shrugged. Just a few conversations with the right people. Neighbors, building staff. Nothing serious. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. You told people my grandmother has dementia? Thomas waved dismissively. It helps our story. Claire didn't respond. For the first time since this plan began, doubt crept into her mind. Because something about Margaret's voice on the phone earlier had sounded very different from what Thomas expected. It hadn't sounded confused. It had sounded calm. And calm people were often the most dangerous opponents of all. 3 weeks passed before the confrontation finally happened. During those weeks, Margaret Holloway rebuilt her life piece by piece with the same steady discipline that had once helped her build a successful consulting business. The small apartment she rented began to transform into a temporary office. A second-hand desk replaced the folding card table. A reliable laptop sat neatly in the center beside organized stacks of documents. Margaret contacted former clients and quietly resumed remote consulting work. The routine helped restore a sense of control. But behind the scenes, the real work was happening through Rebecca Lynn. Margaret's attorney moved quickly. She filed formal fraud complaints, froze several bank transfers, and tracked online listings where Margaret's belongings were being sold. Screenshots piled up, photographs of antique furniture, jewelry, books, and artwork appearing on resale websites under accounts connected to Thomas Reynolds. Each listing strengthened Margaret's case. One afternoon, Rebecca called with news. They've hired a lawyer, she said. What kind? Margaret asked. A divorce attorney. Margaret frowned slightly. That seems unusual. It means they're not expecting a criminal investigation, Rebecca replied. They think this is just a family dispute about property. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. Thomas had underestimated her again. 2 days later, Rebecca arranged a meeting. Neutral location, she explained. A cafe downtown. Public space.
No surprises.
Margaret agreed. On the morning of the meeting, she dressed carefully but simply. Dark trousers, a soft gray jacket, and the pearl earrings that had miraculously remained in her suitcase because she had taken them on her trip. Looking at herself in the mirror, Margaret noticed how much older she seemed than a month earlier. Yet her eyes looked sharper, focused. The cafe Rebecca selected sat on a quiet street lined with tall maple trees. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the quiet murmur of conversations and the soft clatter of dishes. Margaret arrived early and chose a table near the back with a clear view of the entrance. Rebecca joined her shortly afterward, carrying a slim leather folder. Remember, she said calmly, we're not negotiating everything today. Just the items we can prove belong to you. Margaret nodded. I understand. 15 minutes later, the cafe door opened. Claire entered first. Margaret's breath caught for just a moment. It had been nearly a month since she last saw her granddaughter face to face. Claire looked thinner now, her expression guarded. The confident energy Margaret remembered from her youth seemed replaced by tension. Thomas followed behind her. He walked with the same casual confidence Margaret had noticed the first time they met. His suit looked expensive, but something about his smile felt rehearsed rather than natural. A third man entered behind them carrying a briefcase. Their attorney. The three approached the table slowly. Margaret, Claire said politely as they sat down. Margaret noticed immediately that she hadn't used the word grandma. Claire, Margaret replied calmly. Introductions followed. Their lawyer introduced himself as Alan Peterson. Rebecca nodded politely, but said very little. Thomas leaned forward first. Let's keep this simple, he said. We're prepared to settle this situation. Rebecca raised an eyebrow slightly. That's interesting, she said. We haven't presented our demands yet. Peterson cleared his throat. My clients believe there's been a misunderstanding about certain property transfers. Margaret studied Claire's face carefully. There was tension in her eyes. Thomas continued speaking. The apartment was already going to belong to Claire eventually. Margaret had discussed it many times. Margaret spoke quietly. Eventually, Claire shifted slightly in her chair. Thomas pressed forward. We simply formalized the process earlier. Rebecca slid several documents across the table. These are photographs and insurance records documenting specific items that belong to Mrs. Holloway, she explained. Peterson picked up the pages and began reading. Margaret watched his expression change. Concern appeared first, then unease. Rebecca placed several printed screenshots beside the documents. These are online listings created by accounts linked to Mr. Reynolds, she continued. They show these same items being sold. Thomas scoffed. That proves nothing. Rebecca remained calm. It proves enough for a police investigation. The word police hung in the air like a heavy weight. Claire's face turned pale. Thomas shifted in his seat. Peterson looked uncomfortable. Claire spoke quietly. This doesn't have to become criminal. Margaret looked directly at her granddaughter. You emptied my home, she said. You changed legal ownership of my apartment. You drained my bank accounts. Claire looked down at the table. Thomas leaned forward again. You're exaggerating. Margaret ignored him. Why, Claire? The question hung between them. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Claire suddenly said something none of them expected. You were selling the apartment. Margaret blinked in confusion. What? I saw the emails, Claire continued quickly. Real estate agents. Retirement communities in Arizona. Margaret felt understanding spread slowly through her mind. Those emails. Claire, she said gently, those weren't for me. Claire looked up. What do you mean? They were for Judith Miller. Her mother needed help researching assisted living options. I was helping her compare places. Claire's eyes widened slightly. Thomas interrupted immediately. She's lying. But doubt had already appeared in Claire's expression. You told me she was planning to leave, Claire said quietly to Thomas. That's what the emails showed. Margaret spoke again, her voice calm. You've known me your entire life, Claire. If I were planning to leave Seattle, would I hide it from you? Silence followed. Thomas stood abruptly. This meeting is over. Rebecca spoke for the first time in several minutes. Sit down. Her voice was calm but firm. Thomas hesitated. Rebecca tapped her phone lightly. If you leave now, I'll call the detective assigned to the fraud report we filed yesterday. Thomas slowly sat again. Peterson looked alarmed. You filed a police report? Rebecca nodded. Forgery, financial fraud, identity theft, property theft. Claire's composure finally broke. You told the police? She whispered to Margaret. Margaret answered quietly. I told the truth. Claire's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she said. Thomas turned sharply toward her. Claire. But she continued speaking. You said she was abandoning me, Claire told him. You said she was going to sell everything and leave. Thomas glared at her. You believed that because you wanted to believe it. Claire looked at Margaret again. I thought if I didn't act quickly, I'd lose everything. Margaret's voice softened slightly. You never needed to take anything from me. Claire wiped her eyes. Thomas leaned back in his chair with visible frustration. The plan he had carefully built was collapsing faster than he expected. Peterson cleared his throat. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should discuss possible settlement terms. Rebecca nodded slightly. That would be wise. Margaret watched Claire quietly. For the first time since this nightmare began, she saw the child she once raised hiding behind the mistakes of the woman sitting across from her. But forgiveness would not come easily. Too much had already been broken. Nearly a year passed before Margaret Holloway finally felt that her life had settled into something steady again. The legal battle itself had not been as dramatic as many people might imagine. There had been no courtroom shouting or dramatic speeches. Instead, it unfolded through paperwork, negotiations, and quiet pressure from Rebecca Lynn and the police investigation that followed. Once investigators confirmed the forged signatures and traced several online sales back to Thomas Reynolds, the situation changed quickly. Thomas disappeared from the negotiations almost immediately. His lawyer withdrew from the case, and within weeks Thomas moved out of the apartment he had been sharing with Claire. The engagement ended shortly afterward. Margaret never saw him again, though she heard from Rebecca that several fraud investigations involving his previous business ventures had resurfaced. Claire, however, did not disappear. She faced the consequences of what she had done. The apartment transfer was reversed, several bank transactions were recovered, and many of Margaret's belongings were returned by the buyers once they learned the items had been sold illegally. Not everything came back. Some antiques had already been resold too many times to track. Several paintings vanished entirely. But Margaret eventually realized something surprising as the months passed. She didn't want the apartment anymore. The place had become filled with memories of betrayal and conflict. Even when Rebecca confirmed the legal ownership had been restored to Margaret, she decided not to return. Instead, she accepted a financial settlement that allowed her to close that chapter of her life. 6 months after the case ended, Margaret purchased a small house on the outskirts of Seattle. It wasn't nearly as large as her old apartment, and it didn't overlook the water. But it had something the apartment never offered: a small garden in the backyard and quiet streets where neighbors actually spoke to one another. Margaret discovered she liked the simplicity. On a bright spring morning, exactly 1 year after the day she was locked out of her home, Margaret stood in the kitchen of that house preparing coffee. Sunlight streamed through the windows and illuminated the small wooden table where she often worked in the mornings. Her consulting business had slowly returned as well. Several longtime clients had remained loyal, and remote work allowed Margaret to continue advising companies without traveling constantly.
The doorbell rang.
Margaret smiled slightly because she already knew who it would be. Judith Miller never knocked quietly. Margaret opened the door to find her standing on the porch holding a small clay pot filled with purple flowers. "Happy house anniversary," Judith announced proudly. Margaret laughed. "You remembered." "Of course I did," Judith replied. "Someone has to keep track of these things." Judith stepped inside and placed the flowers on the kitchen table. Over the past year, the two women had grown close in a way Margaret never expected. What began as simple neighborly kindness had slowly turned into something much deeper. Judith had helped Margaret through the most difficult weeks after losing the apartment, bringing food, helping organize paperwork, and offering the blunt advice only someone with life experience could provide. They now shared breakfast together every Wednesday morning. Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee. "You're early today," she said. Judith sat down and shrugged. "I had a feeling something interesting might happen." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say that?" Judith nodded toward the front door. "There's a car parked outside that doesn't belong to anyone in this neighborhood." Margaret paused. Her heartbeat slowed slightly as realization formed. "Did you see who was inside?" Judith nodded. "Yes." Margaret set her coffee cup down carefully. "Claire?" Judith gave a small nod. "She's been sitting there for about 10 minutes." Margaret walked slowly to the front window and looked outside. A silver sedan was parked along the curb. Inside, she could see the outline of someone sitting behind the steering wheel. Margaret felt a complicated mixture of emotions rise inside her chest: anger, sadness, nostalgia, and something softer she had been trying not to name. Judith watched her carefully. "You want me to tell her to leave?" Margaret thought for a moment. Then she shook her head.
"No."
Judith nodded approvingly. "I'll be in the garden if you need backup." Margaret walked to the front door and opened it. Claire stepped out of the car immediately. She looked different than the last time Margaret had seen her nearly a year earlier. Her hair was shorter, her clothes simpler. The confident energy she once carried had been replaced by something quieter. She held a small wrapped package in both hands. "Hi," Claire said softly. Margaret studied her granddaughter's face. Hello, Claire. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Finally, Claire stepped forward slowly. I wasn't sure if you'd let me come here, she admitted. I wasn't sure either, Margaret replied honestly. Claire held out the package. I found this while cleaning out some storage boxes. Margaret accepted it and unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a small leather-bound book. Margaret immediately recognized it. Her grandmother's recipe journal. For a moment, she simply stared at it. The book had disappeared during the chaos of the apartment being emptied. Margaret assumed it had been sold or thrown away along with dozens of other personal items. I thought it was lost, she said quietly. Claire nodded. It was stuck behind one of the kitchen drawers. I didn't see it until recently. Margaret opened the journal carefully. Inside were handwritten recipes, passed down through several generations. Between 2 pages, she noticed something unexpected, a small crayon drawing. 2 stick figures standing beside a birthday cake. One labeled me, the other labeled Gran. Margaret remembered that day clearly. Claire had been 7 years old. It was the first birthday after her mother died, and Margaret had tried to make the day feel special despite the sadness that still hung over the house. Claire watched Margaret carefully. I kept the drawing because it was my favorite memory, she said quietly. Margaret closed the journal. Why are you here today, Claire? Claire met her eyes directly. To apologize in person, she said. And to ask something. What? Claire hesitated. Not forgiveness, she said quickly. I know I don't deserve that yet. Margaret listened without interrupting. I just wanted to know if someday we might try to rebuild something, Claire continued. Not the same relationship we had before. I know that's impossible. Margaret considered her words carefully. The pain of what had happened still existed, but time had softened the sharpest edges. The quiet life she had built in this small house had shown her something important. Sometimes losing everything forced people to discover what truly mattered. I'm not ready to forgive completely, Margaret said honestly. Claire nodded. I understand. But, Margaret continued slowly, I'm not interested in holding on to bitterness forever either. Claire looked up. What does that mean? Margaret gave a small, thoughtful smile. It means you can write to me. Claire blinked. You'll read the letters? Yes. And maybe someday answer one? Margaret nodded. Maybe. Claire's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if a weight had lifted. That's more than I expected. They stood quietly for a moment. Finally, Claire stepped backward toward her car. Thank you for seeing me, she said. Margaret watched as she drove away slowly down the quiet street. A moment later, Judith appeared from the garden. Well, she asked. Margaret held up the recipe journal. Small steps, she said. Judith smiled approvingly. Those are usually the ones that last. Later that evening, Margaret sat in the garden behind her new house. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. She opened the recipe journal again and turned to a blank page at the back. Instead of writing a recipe, she began writing something else. Notes about resilience, about betrayal, about rebuilding a life from pieces that once seemed impossible to repair. Her house was smaller than the apartment she had lost. Her life looked different now. But as Margaret finished writing and looked around the quiet garden she had planted with her own hands, she realized something she had not understood before. What had been taken from her had forced her to build something new. And sometimes the life you rebuild turns out to be stronger than the one you lost.